This unbelievable story left detectives and FBI agents speechless, as none of them had ever encountered anything like it in real life. If it had been a movie plot, people would probably have called it too hard to believe. Except that this case really happened, and it will forever stand as one of the strangest on record. Mindi Mebane was born in 1982 in South Carolina. She had loving parents and 2 younger brothers, and from the time she was a kid, she stood out for her compassion and kindness. Friends say Mindi was the one who always showed up, ready to help. She loved anything creative, so after high school, she went to college in Georgia and earned a bachelor in the arts, and then kept going, moved to Virginia, and finished a master's in international relations. In the years that followed, she worked at several law firms, then shifted gears into the nonprofit world because she wanted to help people. Along the way, she also launched a small side business that brought in extra income. Mindi wanted a family. In 2014, she met a man named Nick, and they started dating. He'd served as a Navy judge advocate officer, later as a military prosecutor, and eventually worked at the Pentagon as legal counsel to senior Navy leadership. In 2016, they got married and moved to the quiet suburbs outside Washington. A few years later, Nick left government service to work on a classified software project for Microsoft, while Mindi stayed in the nonprofit world and kept her small business going. Life was steady, and they were talking about kids. But then, out of nowhere, everything flipped. An FBI agent contacted Nick and said he was in danger because of his past work and a classified Microsoft project he was working on. Someone was after him, the agent warned, and that put his whole family at risk. He wouldn't share details, but he told Nick to lay low and do exactly as he said, or the people chasing him would find him fast. So, he moved Nick and Mindi into short-term rentals, but they couldn't stay put for long. They were told to keep moving. The agent picked the places himself and booked them under false names so Nick couldn't be tracked. He said other agents were watching the properties and that as long as Nick and Mindi stayed inside, they were safe, but asked them not to step outside without his say-so. He also pushed them off their normal ways of communication and onto an encrypted messenger where every message disappeared right after it was sent. He also barred them from seeing friends at all, immediate family only, and even that with tight restrictions. Eventually, Mindi couldn't keep going to her work under all those rules and had to quit, so the money started running thin. Nick had serious savings, more than $30 million in stock options, but he couldn't tap them because someone was trying to break into his bank account. The agent said it was the same people who wanted Nick dead, so he arranged to move the money into a trust. Because of the financial problems, in late 2021, they moved into Mindi's younger brother's place in South Carolina. He and his wife let them stay, and, since he was a police officer, Mindi and Nick felt a little safer. Mindi's parents moved in, too, and over the next few months, Nick worked non-stop on the secret Microsoft project, hoping he'd finally get paid. Soon, Mindi's brother decided to sell the house, and they had to move again. Mindi's mom booked them a hotel in Savannah, Georgia, under her name, where they stayed for a few weeks. Then, the FBI agent found them another house and sent them there. Mindi's parents moved in with them again, and they spent a few months in that place while the agent's rules kept getting stricter. Nick and Mindi couldn't leave without clearing it with him first. Her parents had to get approval before coming home, and sometimes sat waiting for hours. Even Mindi's dad, who wasn't working at the time, had to step out almost every day for a few hours because, the agent said, they might be under surveillance and needed to be as careful as possible. They lived in constant tension, but then came a bit of light. Mindi told her parents she was pregnant. It was the best kind of news, and the scariest at the same time. They were thrilled for a grandchild, but worried about raising a baby while Nick and his family were being hunted. All they could do was hope the FBI would sort this out so they could finally stop hiding. By late 2022, Mindi was 8 months pregnant and due in early January. But the pressure on the family kept climbing. Nick now had to hide from his own parents. Through the FBI agent, he was told that he'd actually been kidnapped as a child and later adopted. His biological parents were diplomats, so he cut off contact with his adoptive family. Soon, his adoptive father hired a private investigator, found their address, and showed up with his brother. They tried to force their way in before finally leaving, and no one knew what they were after, which gave Nick and Mindi one more thing to worry about. On top of that, Mindi's health started to slide. Her blood pressure was all over the place, and for almost a month she barely got out of bed. Her parents cared for her around the clock, but at the end of November, they decided to visit their son for a few days. On November 23rd, Thanksgiving, they left while Mindi still felt awful. And after they left, she got worse, so she and Nick decided she needed to go to the hospital. Nick called her parents and said she'd been admitted to a small, private clinic where doctors would keep an eye on her and handle the delivery, which was a little more than a month away. Her parents came back soon after, and Mindi was supposed to be discharged in a few days. She was texting Nick that she felt better, so the doctors decided to let her go home for a couple of weeks. On December 1st, Nick drove to the clinic to pick up his wife, only to be told they'd had to move Mindi to a military hospital because her condition had suddenly gotten worse. The hospital was on a military base, and Nick went there right away. He said he wanted to see his wife, but the doctors told him she was gone. They said she went into cardiac arrest, brought on by dangerously high blood pressure, and doctors couldn't bring her back. Their baby didn't survive, either. Mindi's family was in shock. They'd seen how much her health had crashed over the past month, but they still couldn't take in that their daughter was dead. And they couldn't even see her body because they didn't have clearance to enter the base. A little later, Nick went to collect her remains for a funeral, but the hospital told him she'd already been cremated, without the family's consent. They said her ashes were in neighboring Alabama and gave him an address where he could pick them up. He drove out there, where a man met him by the roadside and handed over an urn with Mindi's ashes. No paperwork, nothing. Even so, Nick started planning a memorial. In the meantime, he rented an apartment for Mindi's parents because it was unbearable for them to stay in the house where they'd all lived in those last months. He kept in regular contact until late February 2023, when he suddenly vanished. A few days later, Mindi's parents got a letter from the FBI agent saying Nick had been in a serious car crash and was in a hospital in critical condition. He wouldn't say which hospital because, he said, Nick was still in danger and the fewer people who knew where he was, the better. Months later, another letter arrived saying Nick had died. Everything about it felt wrong, and Mindi's parents started to wonder if both Nick and Mindi had been killed, maybe by the same people who'd been hunting him for years. But there was nothing they could do, and they were left to live with it, not knowing this was only the beginning. In May 2023, about 6 months after everything that had happened, Mindi's mother got a call from police with a story that shook her to the core. It started on December 2nd, 2022, the day after Nick went to pick up Mindi and was told she'd been moved to a military hospital. A hunter in Georgia headed into the woods outside Savannah. As he walked past a shallow ditch, he noticed something strange and moved closer. To his horror, he realized it was a woman's torso, missing the head and legs. He called police right away, and before long, investigators and agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation were on scene. While the medical team worked to remove the torso, officers began sweeping the area for more evidence. Soon, they got another call. A second hunter, a few hundred yards away, had found a plastic storage container, and next to it, a knife with the handle wrapped in a disinfecting wipe. Detectives figured those items were probably tied to the torso and kept searching the woods. The next day, the same hunter went to a different spot about 2 miles away. As soon as he pushed deeper into the trees, he came across a human leg. That same day, canine units were deployed, and the dogs led officers to a second leg and a container stained with what looked like blood, then to a buried cache of women's clothing, soaked in blood and cut into small pieces, with disinfectant wipes scattered nearby, and a lot of empty trash bags. When the medical examiners reviewed the remains, they put the time of death between November 27th and November 30th, just days before the discovery. And while they couldn't name a single definitive cause, it was clearly a homicide. There were multiple stab wounds along with classic defense injuries, and the body had been dismembered using a saw and a knife. A few days later, search teams with dogs found the victim's head, buried a good distance from everything else. And there was an obvious mark from a heavy blow. Even so, police still couldn't identify her. There were no fingerprints in any database, no DNA to match against, and checks on recent women in the county turned up nothing. The head was badly decomposed, which meant they couldn't say with certainty what the victim looked like. So, detectives turned to a specialist, a forensic artist known for reconstructing faces from skulls. About 2 weeks after the remains were found, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation released a composite of the victim along with a basic description. They were hoping someone would recognize her, but nothing useful came in. That went on for a while, until investigators put out an updated, sharper sketch and added a more precise timeline. Experts now believed she'd been killed on November 27th. And the new sketch finally broke the case open. A woman named Heather called and said the face looked a lot like the wife of her ex-husband, a man named Nick Cassidus. She told them she'd seen Nick with Mindi a few years back, and the sketch was a strong match. Detectives took the lead seriously, but they couldn't find any recent trace of Mindi or Nick. So, they turned to genetic genealogy and sent the DNA to a lab. Over the next few months, specialists built out a family tree that led straight to the victim's relatives, which is why, in the end, they reached out to Mindi's mother. She was stunned by what she was hearing, but agreed to provide a DNA sample, and the test confirmed the victim was her daughter. It was Mindi. The family was in disbelief and walked investigators through the story they'd been living for years. How unknown people were supposedly hunting Nick, how the threat put everyone around him at risk, how Mindi had died of cardiac arrest during late pregnancy, and how Nick had then been in a horrific car crash that, they were told, killed him too. Detectives found the whole thing hard to swallow, because there were no official records of either Mindi or Nick being dead, and if both had really been in hospitals, that absence of paperwork was almost impossible. So, they started tracing Nick's last known steps and ran the plates on the car he'd bought shortly before everything went down, which turned up at a junkyard almost completely burned out. A detail that, on the surface, fit the story about a serious car crash. Even so, they still couldn't find any proof that he was dead. Detectives also learned that shortly before everything went down, Nick and Mindi had changed their last name to Stark, his biological parents' real surname. That led police to a man named Nicholas Killian James Stark, who fit the age and was living in Pennsylvania, married to a woman named Samantha Kolsnick, a fairly well-known true crime author. Investigators reached out and started asking questions about her husband. Looking at Nick's photo, she confirmed that, yes, that was her husband, and he was pretty much alive. She said they'd met in September 2022, a few months before Mindi's death, after Nick messaged her on social media to praise her books, and the two of them started talking. He told her he liked writing true crime stories himself and, on top of that, said his wife Mindi and their unborn child had died years earlier, even though, at that point, Mindi was still alive. Samantha got interested in his short true crime pieces, which he was posting on a forum where he'd built a sizable audience. More than that, Sony had even bought the rights to one of his stories for $300,000. Nick also told Samantha he worked as a corporate lawyer and was constantly on the road from state to state. Soon after Mindi died, he came to Pennsylvania to see Samantha. They started dating, and in March 2023, they got married. They were planning to buy a house, but on the day Nick left the bank with an $800,000 check, his car suddenly caught fire and exploded, destroying everything he owned and the check along with it. But somehow, he walked away without a scratch, just badly shaken. Samantha had no idea that Nick's former wife died after she and Nick had already met. And even that wasn't the only thing she didn't know about him. After Nick's first wife called in and recognized Mindi from the sketch, detectives sat down with her. During their divorce, she said, Nick had agreed to pay her $1.5 million for their house. But he hadn't paid a cent, and for years the authorities couldn't even find him. They also checked with Microsoft, who said Nick had never worked on any of their projects. And when the FBI got involved, they confirmed that none of their agents had spent years helping Nick hide from anyone. That was enough to make an arrest, and Nick was brought in for questioning. He seemed calm and repeated the same story he told Mindi's parents. He'd taken her to a private clinic, she'd suffered cardiac arrest from severe hypertension, and there was nothing anyone could do. Though for some reason, he couldn't remember the clinic's name or where it was. He added that the message about his own death was only partly untrue. He claimed he'd really been in a serious crash and that he and the FBI agent faked his death so the people hunting him wouldn't find him in the hospital. Whenever detectives pressed him on the gaps and contradictions, Nick said the agent had given him specific orders or told him not to share certain details. He also kept insisting he had nothing to do with Mindi's murder and would never hurt her. Even after real FBI agents told him the Bureau had never contacted him and certainly hadn't helped him disappear, Nick stuck to his story. He also claimed Mindi had seen this agent herself, but she wasn't alive to confirm or deny it. Detectives no longer had any doubt Nick was behind Mindi's murder, but two big problems remained: almost no hard evidence and no clear motive. He'd spent years telling his wife and her family that people were hunting him, dragging them from place to place and basically locking them down. For what? They had a few theories, sure, but first they needed proof. And soon, they started to find it. Because the time of death fell on November 27th, the day Mindi's parents left to visit their son, investigators figured the killing happened in the house. They reached out to the property owner and asked if anything seemed off after Nick moved out. Someone had swapped the carpet for a near match, only cheaper, and the original was gone. Crime scene techs went in, and, even after all that time, they found 3 spots where blood had been cleaned up. DNA analysis confirmed it was Mindi's. Then, detectives pulled Nick's location and phone data. On November 29th, he headed toward the same stretch of woods where the remains would turn up and shut his phone off. A CCTV camera at the entrance to that area caught a car just like his rolling in right when the phone went dark. Next, they chased receipts. Back in August, 3 months before the murder, he'd bought rubber gloves and the same disinfecting wipes found near the body parts, which told detectives he'd been planning this for a long time. In November, he made more runs: a knife identical to the one found in the woods, plus a saw, a shovel, and a hammer. By then, prosecutors felt they had what they needed to take the case to trial. 2 years later, in August 2025, the trial began. Nick's lawyer said his client didn't kill his wife. He blamed a so-called FBI agent, a real person but not a real agent, who, he claimed, manipulated Nick and kept him on edge for reasons no one could explain. Prosecutors told a different story. They said Nick made it all up. The threats, the agent, the tens of millions in the bank, the Microsoft job, literally everything. In reality, he was unemployed and deep in debt to his ex-wife. So all the secrecy, the constant moving, the laying low, was really about avoiding that debt and keeping out of the court's reach. They walked the jury through his purchases and location data, and Nick himself admitted he'd gone to those woods, saying he packed Mindi's things into a plastic bin and took them there on the agent's orders. Nick took the stand and repeated the same story again. He insisted he didn't kill his wife, and that everything else he did under pressure from that agent, whoever he really was. Nick's parents took the stand too. They pushed back on his story about being kidnapped as a child and said they were his biological parents. They also stood by him, insisting he could never have done this to his wife, though they admitted he hadn't spoken to them in years. Then came a twist that stunned the jury. We've said Mindi was 8 months pregnant when she died, but the medical experts found no evidence of that at all. In other words, she wasn't pregnant. That was hard to reconcile with what she'd been telling family and friends, and prosecutors said she might have pretended to be pregnant at Nick's request, part of the so-called FBI agent's plan, on the theory that whoever was after him wouldn't target a pregnant woman. There was another, less likely explanation too. Remember Nick's first wife? One reason they split was that she couldn't have children, and Nick wanted to be a father. So, the prosecution suggested Mindi might have invented the pregnancy to keep him from leaving. But even they admitted that didn't quite fit. As for the motive, one theory said Nick learned she wasn't actually pregnant and killed her because of it. But he'd started buying what he needed for the murder 3 months earlier, and by then he'd already gotten involved with another woman. The far more likely scenario, prosecutors said, was brutal in its simplicity. Nick got rid of Mindi so he could be with Samantha. Another moment at trial that grabbed everyone's attention was Nick's writing. He'd been posting short true crime and horror pieces online, and one of them, the one Sony actually bought the rights to, had details that felt uncomfortably close to what happened to Mindi. In the story, A mother-in-law named Betsy slips poison to her son's wife, leaving her sick all the time, while the son himself had lost a previous wife under suspicious circumstances, and his own mother suspected him of killing her. Mindi had been feeling awful for about a month before she was killed, and we now know she wasn't pregnant, which could have explained it. The medical experts didn't find poison in her remains, but there's a theory that Nick could have been dosing her with something that wouldn't leave obvious traces, though no proof of that ever turned up. When the case finally went to the jury, it took a little over an hour. They found Nick guilty of murder. He got life without the possibility of parole, plus another 25 years. So, this incredibly tangled story did reach an ending, even if a lot of it still doesn't add up.